Hello and welcome to Happy Hour. It is me, Eileen Cook. Today is Wednesday, May the 8th. And I thought I would start us off by asking if anyone has any particular questions they want tackled today, because otherwise I have some things to chat about. It's looking good. All right. We see, Alyssa, are you in a new place?
So yeah, the lobby's under construction, so I'm in my boss's office for 2 weeks. So I have a real office with a real desk.
Fancy office.
But
That's
it's
fancy.
temporary, so it's gonna
So don't get too used to it, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Shows you how much we're used to people's space, right? So it's like, that's not what's behind them. So I thought what would be interesting to talk about is we talked about a little bit last week, change. And that got me thinking, and I'm sure you too, of course, about character arc. So I thought it might be interesting to just sort of look at that topic in particular today and kind of go from there. So a character arc is sort of what we think of as kind of almost the purpose of fiction. Like that's what's often happening. And it is some kind of journey that the character, particularly the main character, is undergoing, which might be spiritual, emotional, intellectual, physical, or some kind of combination of all of those. And you'll see most writing coaches and mentors sort of talking about the idea that you want definitely your main character to have some kind of arc that they're going through during that time period. But I'm going to argue, that even thinking and spending a little bit of time on what kind of character arc your secondary or, sort of background characters might be going through does just sort of add a layer of richness to the story. So even just giving that a little bit of thought about how those people might be different at the end of the story is useful. Now, a character arc can be positive, negative, or flat. So I want to sort of talk about all three of those a little bit and then kind of get into some examples and we'll go from there. So in a flat arc, the character doesn't actually change. So when does that happen? So I think one of the ones that you see most often is in any kind of mystery series. You'll sort of often see a main character that doesn't really fundamentally change all that often. Typically what they're doing is they somehow know the truth, and we're going to talk about truth more in positive and negative for a minute, but they're just sort of watching the world around them change, and they're trying to sort of educate the world around them. Now let's talk about positive or negative. So in that, positive, of course, is the character is forced to face the world and some sort of lie that they believe that then changes and they triumph in the end. In a negative character arc, they're somehow facing the world, the lie that they believe, and then they fail. So thinking a little bit about, and I think this is an interesting thing, what is the lie that your character believes? So what is that thing that they tell themselves that is possibly not true that they have to then overcome? So for oftentimes in romance, it may be something like, I don't deserve love, or you can't have love and a career at the same time, or it might be that I'm not strong, or it might be I'm not worthy of attention, I don't deserve to be a writer, insert whatever that is, but it's some kind of lie that they believe. You'll hear some people talk about what's your character's ghost, or that's the idea of what is it that made them believe that lie. If you like Michael Haig, and he's a screenwriting instructor, he talks a lot about what is the hole in your character's soul, which is fun to say if you're, been drinking for a little while, which I haven't, just in case you're worried, so I can still say it here at 9. But that is the idea that something happened to them that sort of fundamentally created the lie that they believe. And that's actually pretty true with humans in general, right? So we kind of come to sort of an established understanding of how the world works fairly early. And this is, you can argue nature versus nurture, but there's definitely this sort of sense that we have an idea of how the world works, that the world is a good place or the world is a bad place. You can trust people, you can't trust people. Everyone who loves you leaves. I can come up with thousands of different things that may be something that you tell yourself. And for most cases, when we're talking about our characters, it's the idea that there is something that they believe that's not serving them. And that's the thing that they are dealing with, or the challenge that they're sort of being forced to face as they go through whatever journey that you're putting them on, whether that's physical or not. So one of the things that might be helpful to think about when you're kind of thinking about designing a character arc is kind of those questions. So what is the lie that my character believes? Kind of what fundamentally maybe led them to accept that lie, because that comes from something. We learn that from some event in our life. And what is the truth that they then have to accept? So if a character, let's choose Marianne for a minute. Let's think about one of your characters. What is an example of a lie that they tell themselves?
Okay, here's one that's maybe not so commonplace. That their essential true self is invalid because they've been raised by parents or in a world or environment where certain values or characteristics are elevated and others are denigrated. And if they feel that that their true self is in conflict with that esteemed world, universe, then they will feel that they need to be more like that, and that this feeling inside of themselves, that is their true selves, is lesser somehow.
And you've basically gold star for Marianne, because she's gotten all three of those things, right? So the lie that they believe, where that comes from, and then what is the truth that they must come to accept.
Were you looking for a more specific, concrete example?
No, I think, because oftentimes when we talk about goal, like truth is sometimes, or the lie that the character believes is often a little bit fuzzy, right? Like it's a sense of not feeling worthwhile or feeling that you can't trust people. It tends to be like, I'm not even sure that people can often put their finger on it. Like if you send someone to counseling, and of course, I always kind of default to when I'm thinking about working with real people, is you kind of, default to what is it that they're telling themselves that they're repeating over and over, right? So we've talked a lot, within the Creative Academy about setting kind of positive affirmations, and the idea of like, repeating after yourself, I am a writer. What I write has value, because we're trying to take away the ongoing thing that we tell ourselves, which is things like, nothing that I write is any good. No one's going to want to read anything that I write, kind of unhealthy messages that aren't serving us. And we do that in real life, and our characters are doing it, but they may not be aware of it, right? So you may run into a writer who tells themselves, hang on while I yell at my dog. So I don't have to yell at them. Someone else is going to do it. So what you will see is a character who may not even be aware of it. So the real life writer who might say like, oh no, I'm doing everything I can. But like when you push them, they don't really believe in their own story. They don't really feel that their story has value. And that of course then impacts the various challenges they face in trying to sort of publish, and whether or not
Big lag.
I tried to do my yelling off camera. There you go.
I was also thinking, if I can interject, Eileen, it's not uncommon for a person, real or fictional, to give undue weight to the opinion of one person, living or dead, whose opinion, who's been influential somehow. And they can sort of
Go on.
okay,
One
sorry.
person's wait. I was paying
Very
attention.
entertaining. Anyway, they can subsume the value, their own value, in what they believe this person that they idolize or worship or grieve for or whatever would have wanted them to be,
Well, I
or
think a lot of us are caught up in what we think other people want from us. And we sort of, I was having an interesting discussion with a couple of other women. We've recently been reading the book, Crystal, Donna, and I have all been reading You Are a Badass at Money, which I'm not sure if other people have read, but it is lovely. And, one of the things that it talks about in that book is it has you look in the mirror and say, I want to be rich. And it talks about how so many of us feel very uncomfortable with that. And we insert and we say, well, money's not important to me. What's important to me is family. And the book interjects is sort of first saying that, understanding that money allows us to do those other things, right? Like if you have a certain amount of money, you have time to spend with your family that you may not have if you're having to work 7 jobs, for example, to cover basic needs. And it talks about, money doesn't have to be, $1 million a year. It might be $20,000 a year, depending on what being rich is for you, right? And it was very interesting to me to sort of confront those ideas. And the book really asks you to look at what are the messages that you got about money from your family of origin, right? Which is often where those things develop, right? And sometimes that's a very deliberate thing. So I grew up, both of my parents are first generation Americans. So both of my sets of grandparents were all immigrants. And so there was very much the setting and the thing that you have to work hard, you don't get into debt, that you're responsible. So doing things like pursuing an artistic career, I feel very...
That's a lovely hobby, but you have to be practical because life is hard. And
yes.
Yeah.
Or as my dad would call it, tinkering with pencils, which is what writing was. So, sort of realizing what those messages are and then how those then impact you. So I have a couple examples from just very basic stories. So I just picked 2 from an article. So they talked about the Hobbit, for example. So a character has a goal, which is to the hobbits want to reclaim the treasure that's been stolen by Smaug. And the lie that they tell themselves is that hobbits belong in the Shire and that the outside world requires braver types, right? The outside world is not for hobbits. The outside world is for brave men all that kind of thing. And of course, what they have to come to realize over the course of that is that bravery is more about inner strength than exterior strength. Now it is shown. So for example, things like Bilbo and all that, he gets better at the external kinds of strength. Like he actually gets better at sword fighting and those kinds of things. But what you're sort of seeing that happen is through the internal journey. Or if you think about something like A Christmas Carol, the goal for, Scrooge is that he doesn't want to die like Marley. Like he's seen the ghost of Christmas to come. He doesn't want that. And of course, the lie that he tells himself is that personal value is connected to wealth.
The other thing I think about that, the Hague transformation from identity to essence is the idea that the heroic self was always in there, so the Hobbit, although they're not necessarily, heroic sword fighting, horse riding warriors, have a heroic spirit. They have an inherent strength of character. That's the thing that matters in the end when it comes to fighting a battle with the powers of the ring, ultimately. And I was thinking about Scrooge, for example. His essential self was kind and loving and wounded because of losing his sister and being rejected by the woman that he loves. And all of that was suppressed under false beliefs. that you need wealth in order to
gain love, right? So
love, to be accepted and to be respected, and because that love affair didn't work out and it was about social status and wealth. But the idea that he becomes something that he isn't really the part of the arc. It's like chipping away at all the lies to reveal the true essential self that's always been underneath, but has been sort of beaten up somehow.
And that, I think, is where we can sort of talk about whether or not, and this is certainly at the base of a lot of counseling theories, which is, are we fundamentally, in our essence, good people who've had things happen to us that have led us down certain paths? Or is there something fundamentally hardwired into people? So, for example, Bonnie's put in the chat window that, some hobbits don't have that spirit, and that's kind of what makes the few special. And if you want to, put some hobbits on the couch, I think you can have the discussion with, do all hobbits have it, but they don't challenge themselves to find that? Or is there something hardwired within the hobbiton species that makes it that it is a very rare person that finds that? And I don't know if, one, they're mythical creatures, so we're not going to have that moment of things, but you will certainly see certain counselors who prescribe to the idea that in our essence, all of us are brave, loving creatures, but that something sometimes has happened to some of us in the past, and it's the story that we tell ourselves, right? And so I get into that a lot around the narrative of what is the story that I tell myself that makes sense of the experiences that happened to me.
The Hobbit thing is like a cultural self-talk. It's like, this is the way we see ourselves, and that's perpetuated generation after generation and through every aspect of the way that they live. And so whether all of them have that heroic core or not isn't important, because the story is what's important, because the story is what, the whole throwing rocks and lighting your protagonist on fire to reveal and transform.
Well, and there's a lot of discussion that Tolkien was describing various ethnic groups, right? So the hobbits are meant in a lot of ways, you'll read a lot of things, that those are the British, right? And the British are reserved, and they were a very Anglo-Saxon focused culture, particularly when Tolkien was writing. So there's that kind of thing. Yeah, right? So the Shire being England, right? And we don't leave it because there's nothing good to be gained out there from that experience. And certainly the war would have been part of that, right? And so do we kind of go back into that? So thinking about that, right? So when we then talk about character arcs, so kind of going back to that and kind of touching base with which we talked about last week, is fundamentally what makes us change, or what makes us confront those lies, right? And usually what ends up happening, and I think it's useful to think about real people that you know in their life, about what happens to them that makes them shift or change. So the biggest thing that we know is strong emotion. That's what makes a change. So where that strong emotion comes from. So thinking about, Marianne used the term, we're going to throw rocks, or, basically otherwise make our characters go through something. But that is often what changes it for other people, is there is something that happens to them. So if you think about health concerns, I have to beat my dog, one moment. Someone's going to sit next to me for a little while until he can learn to behave.
Reflection in your shiny table.
Yeah, well, I have a friend visiting, and so for whatever reason, probably because he knows that she's not a dog person, like anytime she's walking around, he has to make sure that everyone knows that she's walking around his house.
With 2 dogs.
Yeah, that's Gimlet, who's much better. Going back to character arc and strong emotions, what is it someone change? What is it that does that? So health scares are a common thing where you will sort of see people who might, for example, have a chance of a heart attack or something like that, and suddenly they change the way that they live and how they eat, and that they start getting regular exercise and they're doing certain things. That typically comes about because they got scared. Something happened to them. Guilt can be a strong emotion. So maybe you've done something and you realize that you've actually harmed someone. I was talking to someone else the other day and they said, they were talking about a past relationship and said, I never realized, how much I had harmed that person by my careless, I just thought it was all a joke. And so it wasn't until much later that they realized that and then made a very conscious choice about how they were going to interact with people after that. And you'll hear people have the discussion around, be kind to others. You don't know what battle they're facing. That's often a little Facebook meme that goes around. But you'll see that, right? So, having a discussion with someone who maybe has gone through a loss or a divorce or something like that, where suddenly you're looking around the world and you're realizing, oh, other people are dealing with this too. And maybe I want to sort of be a little bit more different in my interactions with them. So thinking about if your character is going to face some kind of strong emotion that's going to pull, sort of have some sort of impact and change how they see things.
And sometimes a tough choice comes into it, right?
Oh yeah, no, and we're going to get into that in a minute. So don't get ahead of me, Marianne. Sometimes what makes people change is some kind of a commitment to what it will be like on the other side. So that is the idea that someone has a hopeful thing that they want to sort of pursue or to chase after. So it's something that they want to go for, and it pulls them to that other side. So on a very small scale, you'll see someone who, for example, might be coming up to their wedding day and they really want to wear their grandmother's wedding dress, which means that they're going to have to, change shapes in some way, shape, or form. And so, they'll commit to an exercise program. They'll, change what they're eating because they desperately want that particular thing. And this all cycles back to, and I've talked about it multiple times, but I don't think it hurts talking about again, which is the idea that people are pushed or pulled. So we are either pushed into making a change because something about where we are is now so untenable that we must make a change, or we are pulled. There is something so desirable that we are suddenly wanting to make a change. So, for example, and not that the change always works, just for clarification, but let's talk about something like addiction. So you may have someone who has struggled with addiction for a long period of time. There's all sorts of things that they tell themselves about that addiction. And then they have a child. And you will see some people where, for example, social services may come in and take that child away from them. And that may be the push that they need. That's the idea that they have basically hit, quote unquote, rock bottom. Like they can't get any lower than where they are. And suddenly they just can't face that anymore. Someone else may have a pull motivation. So they've had a child and all of a sudden it's like, I couldn't do it for me, but I so desperately want to be the mother that I think this child deserves that I'm going to kind of leverage myself out of that. Can be both. It can be both a push and a pull happening at the same time. And again, people may not succeed with that. And in fact, there's certainly countless stories and TV shows all about people who don't succeed with particularly the challenge of addiction. But there is usually something that is happening that is confronting the individual with some kind of choice, right? So Marianne sort of mentioned that idea that there's some sort of challenge that is facing your character. So what is it that's happening that is making them deal with that? So on a very happy kind of thing, let's talk romance, right? So you have a character who tells themselves, I am not worthy of romantic love. All I've seen in romantic love is that it goes badly for everyone, and I don't want it. And then when it does work, it's just a vicious lie that all hasn't fallen apart yet. And we know where that comes from. And then they're confronted with someone who they find attractive and appealing. And there's something that's happening in that that's often pulling them towards wanting to be in that relationship. But there may also be a push, something happening behind them that is making them realize that maybe they can't go it on their own anymore, that they need someone else in their life. So that may be something that will be helpful with that. So I think one of the reasons that I kind of think, there's kind of the trope that we tend to write autobiographical characters in our first few books. So our first initial characters tend to bear a more than striking resemblance to some of us. And I think that's because we understand that internal journey so well. So we understand how and why we made changes. So we may place ourselves in space or in a different time in history or something else, but that character is kind of fundamentally us. And it's because we understand how we sort of are dealing with our own stuff, or we're writing in a way to kind of figure that out for ourselves. So it was quite interesting to me. I was on a panel once, and it was a school kids panel. And so we were all being asked different questions. And one of the kids stood up and basically said, I noticed that all of your books are about a character who is figuring out who they are, separate from kind of who others want them to be, or coming to terms with who they are at their own sense. Why do you think you're drawn to that topic? And I had this moment of utter panic and clarity where I realized, oh my God, every single character I've ever written deals with that. I thought I had it all together. I thought I knew, like, oh no, this is about this and this is about that. But even though the worlds were very different, so certainly in my very first book, it's a romantic comedy, and it's all dealing with a character who pretends to be a psychic in order to get her ex-boyfriend back. But it's all about the lies that she's telling herself in order to kind of figure out who she really wants to be. And then you can take something like With Malice, which I would say is a completely different book, because it's about murder and mayhem, but it's fundamentally about the character figuring out who she really is and whether or not she's capable of what she's being accused of doing. So I found it just slightly fascinating that clearly that's something that I'm sorting out in myself, and I'm sorting it out through my characters in those different situations. So I think particularly you'll often see when I talk to someone who's writing their first book, it'll be like, oh, this is my story about a woman in her 50s who's coming back after divorce and, rediscovering love and her passion. And then when you talk to them for a little bit, she's a woman in her 50s who's recently been divorced and is trying to maybe figure out. So she's maybe made the situation a bit bigger or more extravagant, but because we know our own internal journey, it's much easier to write that. So what do you do if you want to write someone whose internal journey is completely 100 degrees different than your own? So I think one of the things that can really help, and I mentioned this last week, is looking at other self-help books that might be dealing with whatever your character is coping with. And I can guarantee you, if you haven't been to Chapters or Indigo recently, there's 1,000,001 books on any possible conflict. I was going to say barring alien abduction, but possibly even with alien abduction, for all I know, by those characters. So there's, characters who love too much, too little, dealing with addiction, divorce, death, dealing with the loss of a child, dealing with the loss of a parent, dealing with whatever that is, gaining confidence, learning inner strength, getting fit, getting healthy, whatever that is, there is a self-help book about it. And I would really encourage you to, check those out and look at them as a source of research, because several things will be in those books. So first of all, there's almost always several examples of how other people have gone through that process. So it might give you some perfect things to sort of steal, right? So those are experiences that other people have had in that, and they're talking about how it impacts them. And it's also useful to sort of think about what are those different reactions and how they talk about it. So one of the books that I wrote was about adoption. And I wasn't adopted. I went through a period where I wanted to be adopted because I wanted nothing to do with my own family, and I desperately wanted my real family to be better and somehow come find me, which would never be the case. But I wanted to write about adoption. And I did have my cousin who has adopted her child. And so talking with her about that and hearing her experiences, and I just became very interested in looking at that. And so I, people about adoption and works with it. And it was fascinating to me how there tended to be almost two kinds of narratives. So one group of people who felt abandonment issues, right? Like, what fundamentally happened that my family, my birth family, gave me up. And then another group of people who, again, who've had the exact same example, tended to view it through a lens of, how fortunate am I that I was chosen? So you were, just born into your family. They had no choice with you. My family chose me, and they felt a lot of pride in that. And then, of course, people who went back and forth between those two middles. But I found it very interesting in talking to them what kind of led them to each of those different beliefs, when obviously the core event was the same for both of them. Although, again, there's variations within all of that. So in my cousin's case, the child she has adopted, her birth family had 3 kids or 4 kids before her, and they just simply could not afford another child. And they're Christian, so they were not going to abort the child. So they gave up their child for adoption. So my cousin's daughter knows that she has a birth family and that she has 3 siblings that are full blood siblings that live with her birth parents, and that she herself was then adopted. And I find it interesting because, at least at this point, she's still very young. She feels very fortunate that she is with her birth or with her adopted family. But I wonder how that will play out as things go along. So that for me is fascinating. That's what I enjoy about writing characters. So I'm going to encourage you to sort of think about what's happened to them, what's that narrative that they're telling themselves, and where that goes. If you're having challenges getting into other people's heads, another thing I want to recommend in addition to self-help books is, has anyone listened to the podcast, Where Should We Begin? I'm going to highly recommend listening to just an episode or two, just in terms of, it's a bit of a fascination among counselor types. It is actual live counseling, marriage counseling sessions held with a marriage therapist. So they're actual recorded sessions that you're listening to. And there are couples dealing with everything, infidelity, sexual dysfunction, you name it. It's very raw. It's very, and sometimes almost difficult to listen to, but it's very interesting. The counselor who has recorded these sessions with, by the way, the people's permission, this is not some weird voyeur thing. She is talking about basically what kind of lies is she hearing the person telling themselves, and her attempts to sort of confront those gently. So when you listen to the sessions, you can sort of hear what the people are saying. And in some cases, you yourself will spot it. You'll be like, oh, but wait, they're saying, they're putting this meaning onto what happened, and that doesn't necessarily have that meaning, and what's going on with that, and what's going on with this. And it's just very interesting in terms of sort of dissecting the human spirit and how we make sense of things to sort of be that fly on the wall. So I would highly recommend that as kind of a very visceral, emotional chance to see people going through an arc, right? And so it's kind of a question as to whether or not these couples will make it or not make it. And you have the chance to sort of see that. And certainly for me, again, both having worked as a counselor and then also being interested in people from a writing perspective, what it is that they're telling themselves. So what's happening? So to kind of bring this all up, and then we'll take any examples or questions, is your character has some fundamental things that they tell themselves. In many cases, there's a certain lie that they tell themselves, but not necessarily. Like, again, when we talk about a flat arc, you may have a character that knows the truth, and it's just the rest of the world that doesn't. And so they have to basically help the rest of the world catch up to that sort of fundamental truth. But in many cases, there's something that they tell themselves, and then the events of the story are going to challenge them. And they're going to put them in situations where they have to fundamentally confront that belief and either double down and reinforce it, or start to challenge and think of the world in a different place. When you're writing, remember that this is very rarely a one-time change. People very rarely go from I don't deserve love to like, of course I do. And I'm going to go out and seek a healthy, relationship right now. They're usually trying different things and then stumbling and then reverting. And again, if you like Michael Haig, he talks about it in terms of essence, right? So he talks about the mask that we put on ourselves, and that, kind of over the course of the film, that the characters getting in touch with who they really are at the core. But that is a process, and it's definitely not easy. And Alyssa has a suggestion in the chat window called a podcast called Other People's Problems. So I think that would be, particularly also interesting to listen to, because I think we know our own journey, but sometimes hearing someone else go through that process can be really, really helpful. So the question about what do you do with a character arc over the course of a series? So there are a couple of different ways, I think, to tackle this. And certainly one of the biggest ones is to think about what do you want the arc to be over the entire course of the whole series? So if you are thinking, for example, Harry Potter, who is Harry Potter at the beginning of the books, and who is Harry Potter at the end of those 4 or 8? After the many Harry Potter books, right? So he's sort of changing and kind of moving. So his arc, actually, there's a mini arc that's happening kind of within each book. So it's very similar to plotting, right? When you think of a conflict in a series, you're thinking about what's the overall arching conflict that they're going to have to deal with, and then what's going to happen in each book. But you will see some series where the character fundamentally doesn't change. So again, if you, particularly mystery series, you'll see where you have a detective, there's not a lot of changes other than it is the truth in the world that they're trying to change. So I think you could have a series where you would have a character who needs to make a change to realize some truth about themselves in book 1. And then for the books that come after that, they're not so much changing as much as they're trying to help other people fundamentally realize that this thing is happening. So I mentioned, I think last week, that I've had a chance to read an advanced book by Joelle Charbonneau called Verify, which will be coming out, I think, in the fall. And it's a very kind of 1984 dystopian story. And I know that she's planning this to be a series, right? So I think what is interesting is in the first book, the character is having to realize that all of society that she believes is a lie, right? The government has shielded her from the truth. And really the arc in that first book is her coming to accept that and taking on the mantle of, I'm now going to help other people see that. So while I think the character will be dealing with issues of romance and trust and other things in other books, I think the bigger arc will be in the other books, her helping other people make that change from this is safe to accept what the government tells us and not necessarily the same. All right, I'm going to look up these resources real quick so you people have them. Other thoughts about character that you guys are dealing with? What's working for you, or anything that you struggled with? Tracy, are you? Oh, you're still muted.
There we go. Well, the one thing I tended to be like, because I started writing through NaNoWriMo, so I tended to be a bit of a pantser. So I'm trying to become a little bit more of a planner so I can have more consistency with my characters, which is probably one of my challenges. It's not that they change crazy, but there'll be some inconsistencies in the story as it progresses with their character that really shouldn't change, because it doesn't really, like in the story, there's no reason for them to have changed that way, and they do. So I'm trying to do more like this kind of stuff where it's like a character sheet to help me kind of write out some basic functions. But if anyone has any other ideas on great ways to keep your characters changing, but not the basic stuff, the stuff that shouldn't change, that makes any sense?
Yes, it does. I mean, I think part of that is, and this is very useful, I think, if you also are doing a series, is to think about kind of how am I going to track all of this information? So, for example, I'll pick on Alyssa, who's doing this series, like who are all the people that she's meeting? And if in book 4 you want to reference someone that they met you know, on a slave train, like not having to page back through 300 pages to try and find that name, that character is going to be a smart idea. So, you know, then having within like a character sheet, like you're talking about, Tracy, where it's like, this is the way that I keep track of those character details. And I've seen some people that have just done basically a spreadsheet, like what are the things that they tell themselves and where do those things come from if they happen to know, right? And if they don't know, then I think that's a really interesting exercise to do for yourself, which is if your character has a particular belief, it came from somewhere. They got that message someplace, whether that was, you know, a deliberate message. Again, we were talking about the relationship with money, where it's like, I very much heard from my parents, like, you know, have to earn, like that was a message that I got over and over again, that debt is horrible, those kinds of things, like you have to be responsible with money. That was a very verbal. But you may also have gotten a message where maybe your mom worked all the time and you always felt that, you know, her job came before you and anything that you were doing and that kind of thing. And so you may have internalized that to have money means you can't care about anyone else. So you deliberately make choices because you're like, well, I want to have love in my life, so therefore I can't have money. When in fact, those two things don't necessarily have to not coexist, right? But you got that message in an unintended way. Sometimes it's intended, sometimes it's not intended, but thinking about that. And I think for most of us, we don't dig really deep into that to really kind of unearth all of that, right? So Marianne has a question here. So back to the series, is there a different strategy to approach a longer arc instead of them having an epiphany in book one and spending the rest of the series trying to make changes outside themselves? Yes. So I think it's very similar. Like, I think doing a character arc is basically very similar. And do people know Michael Haig's 6 stages? I'm going to put a link to that. So hang on. That's a whole, we might have to do that as a whole office hour on it to itself because it's lovely. Let me find it. If I could spell his name right, that would help. So he does a lovely which I have copied and used many a time, but he uses a 6-stage plot structure. So what you will see is it's an act 1, act 2, act 3. And at the bottom of his is a outer journey. So what's happening in the outer journey, and the internal is of course what's happening inside your character. So let me get this up on the screen so you guys can all see it. There it is.
So I find it interesting that he seems to think that your character starts out sort of at this like complete, and then 10% of the way in start longing. Whereas I think most people would say that like from page 1, you need to know what your character is missing, what your character wants.
So, but does the character know?
Ah, right. Okay, yeah.
Right, and probably not. So just so everyone can be seeing it at the same time. So this is his, so at the very top is sort of his idea that the internal is that idea that, you know, things are sort of going along, everything is good, then something has happened, which is turning point 1, and that is basically giving them ideas about what might happen, right? So, and again, when we talk about 10%, keep in mind, when you're talking about a movie, you're talking about a very small amount of time. Like this is happening within the first couple of minutes of the story in most cases. So it is that idea where we're just getting a little bit. But when you think of this as being the plot for a story, act 1, act 2, act 3, if you're doing a series, I think you can put the same structure over the whole book series. So you can make a decision that book 1 is this part, book 2 is this part, but this is the overall thing that is happening within all of it. So fundamentally at the end, I want to know that the bad guy has been beaten, those kinds of things? What is the thing that is getting resolved after the end of all of those books? So if you think about the Hunger Games, for example, where, you know, the final book in that series is all about things coming to an end, that the government had, like, it's the final triumph of all of that, but you can see the setup is happening in each of those, and the same structure is happening within that larger piece. Does that make sense, or does it make sense only in my head? Which sometimes happens to me. So I would recommend, if people haven't taken a peek at the Michael Higg 6-step plot structure, that I find it really useful. His website also has examples from film. Keep in mind, he is a screenwriter, so things, he defaults to film examples primarily. But it is still, I think, a really useful basis to think about that internal journey that is happening at the same time and how that is changing things. Because again, like when he talks about sort of what we'd call that inciting incident, that's what creates the longing within the character. So, right? So it's like they're kind of going along, and then something's happened that makes them start to think and imagine things outside of themselves, which then commences them on that journey. So Mary said, do we try and fit a mini arc inside each piece of the longer arc? I don't kind of get that macro on it. So basically what I would sort of think to myself is, instead of trying to finish a mini arc within each arc, is just thinking of each book has this same structure, and then the same structure exists on the overall thing. Right? So it's not, okay, book one is only going to be stage one setup. Like, it's still its own full and complete story, but there is something that is carrying over all of those stories that is that bigger thing, if that makes sense. So I'm thinking Game of Thrones. So for a moment, and I won't do any spoilers for people, right? But if you watched, you know, season one, there is something that happened, but the overall thing that we're kind of coming to an end to now, right, is I'm willing to bet that that final turning point, the climax, is going to be when there's the final battle with Cersei, right? So hang on one second. Let's go back. And I have done no homework on this, so stick with me as we go about that. But if we look at the Game of Thrones, all of the series, and I try and put this structure on it, sort of the setup is getting the idea that there are the kingdoms, that all of this is happening, right? And then the turning point one is when the king dies. And now we're going to be, you know, kind of thrust into that. Then you're looking at kind of different things happening in terms of different people coming up to various points, right? Point of no return may be when Daenerys comes over. So she sails with the, I always pronounce these good, the Thrakis. Yeah. To kind of come over, and then complications and higher stakes. There's dealing with the whole season where we realize that the dead are going to cause all sorts of extra problems that are going to be going on. And the aftermath is going to be, however this finish, whoever ends up on the Iron Throne. So it's had its own arc, but then if you could go almost each season, and there would be this arc within that. And then if you want to get really fancy, within each episode, there is this kind of tiny little detail that's happening. So how's that? So you can sit down and you have my permission to watch the Game of Thrones for the next 4 days and see if you can find this mini arcs into each and every one of them, because I'm willing to bet, while not every point is going to be there, it is. So Bonnie works in middle grade characters. I think it works very much the same way. So the characters within a middle grade, that there is something that they are fundamentally sorting out. And in some ways, they're putting that belief structure in place for the first time, right? So they're at that age where they are coming up with those lies. So hopefully you have a happy story, and they're coming up with a truth that will serve them well as they go into the world. But they may be telling themselves something that, you know, as an adult reader, we might look back and think, who is that, right? So in Game of Thrones, who is the main character? I think it changes from, I haven't read the books, so I'm at a bit of a disadvantage, but I do think it changes from book to book. I'm not sure that you could say that there is one main character, and certainly every single one of them has their own arc that they're going through in that. And I think that makes a bigger difference. And Marianne, you said, but the character arcs, I think it is the same, right? Because you can look at the Michael Haig thing and you can see that growth from sort of essence, identity into essence and sort of back and forth. And you can think about the characters in Game of Thrones. So who is Jon now versus who was he, and what stories and what things has he discovered about himself and all those kind of things. Middle grade YA is almost to some degree about that coming of age. Bonnie, you've put your finger on it. There is some part where you are starting to see who you want to be as a person. So I've heard it argued that middle grade is figuring out how you fit into the world around you, and YA is about figuring out how you stand out from the world that was your growth world that you grew up within. So middle grade is figuring out, how do I fit into my family? Who am I within my family? Those kinds of things. And YA is about, who am I going to be outside of my family as I now become an independent, hopefully functioning adult, which is somewhat debatable. Other questions on that? I think we might talk about structure, because I think there's some useful stuff, and maybe another office hour if people have some thoughts on that. Alyssa?
So I think realistically in real life, like, people change and then they revert back, and they change and they revert back. And we feel like we've got a handle on something, we feel like we've solved something, and then we revert back. But I feel like in fiction, we don't want to read about that. We want to read about people who fix what's wrong with them and become better people. So do you have any comments on, like, straddling the realistic versus...
Well, I mean, I guess I'm going to argue, I think we see one sliver of life in fiction, right? So, we don't necessarily, like, for example, the truth of the matter is, in romance, the reason they often end it as a wedding is we don't want to see those characters 6 months later when they're fighting about who left their toenails on the bathroom floor, which is what married life is often about, right? So it is that kind of thing of, we don't want to see people slip back to old patterns. We just want to assume that they stay happily ever after. Although if we're at all logical, we know there's going to be ups and downs in any of those relationships. So in fiction, we're often stopping the narratives where we don't see that. But I would also say in real life, I do think people fundamentally change. I don't think it's as common as we would like it to be, but you do see people who make fundamental shifts and change about what they're going to do. And I think the reason that a lot of people don't make those changes is that strong emotion is hard for us, and we will tend to hide from that. So it's one of the things, like, where we often talk about travel has so many benefits, right? So if you push yourself outside of your comfort zone, it maybe forces you to realize things about yourself. You'll often see people say, if this horrible thing hadn't happened, I wouldn't have made this sort of shift. But most of us avoid horrible things, and we don't have to deal with things like alien abductions and war and, big things that often do leverage the kind of change that we hope people will make. But tons of people are invested in going to counseling because they believe they are capable of making a lasting change, which doesn't mean, just in the same way that you may have a very healthy marriage and relationship, isn't going to mean that you're not going to have days where you fight and you argue and you think, like, I can't believe I got tethered to this particular person. Like, what a huge mistake that was. But the next day you may be madly in love with them again, right? So if you think of a marriage as a series arc, how has that worked, and how have the things kind of come in and out? Which I think is a useful way of doing it. I was having a discussion about marriage with someone else, and she said, I've been married 5 times. And it threw me, because I was like, what? Because I happen to know she's been with her spouse for many. And she was like, there was my marriage of who we were before we had kids. Then there was my marriage that we had when we had small kids. Then there was my marriage when we had high school, teenage kids. And now there's the marriage that we're having as we are now going into. And she's like, each of those relationships has been different. each of those have different points. So my marriage has been very different at each of those points. And I thought that was a very interesting way of thinking about our lives, because we tend to think like, well, this is who I am. But we've had, if you want to think of it that way, we've had multiple lives. There's who you've been at different times. And those are not the same person. Who I am now, there are some things that are consistent, but there are many things that are very different than who I was as a child. So it's kind of interesting to think of that kind of way. And yeah, I mean, I think in fiction, we're looking for big, obvious things that are going to make shifts. And a lot of literary fiction is about that smaller, quieter change. So that's something to think about if you're doing that kind of fiction. All right, I am aware that we are running out of time. So are there any last minute questions or comments? Doesn't have to be a question. Yes, and that's possibly why many marriages don't make that shift, Marianne. So if you're in the chat window, it's that ability to successfully shift and to keep the parts that work and don't work. And it's the same again with people. Like, what is your ability to keep the things about yourself that you like and adapt to the new things, and what are the things that don't, right? So when I see people who still talk about high school as the best time of their life, which is creepy and weird, I think it's their inability to accept who they are at this particular juncture. All right, everyone, as always, thank you so much. Good to see you all. I hope everyone has a good rest of the week and get some writing done. If you have any questions or comments, let me know. If you want to dive deep and talk about a character arc in your particular book, I'd be happy to use that as a case study if somebody wants to email me, and we can sort of set that up and make that happen. All right, until then, take care, everyone, and have a good week.
Thanks. Bye.